In Flanders fields the poppies grow, between the crosses row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead, short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. This is an excerpt of a poem written by a Canadian soldier during the First World War. To this day in Europe, many people still wear poppies during the month of November in remembrance of the Great War. A total of 15 to 22 million people died in World War I. About 6 million of those were civilian deaths. An entire generation of British, French, and German youth was lost, and empires were destroyed. However, in the United States, the specter of it doesn't loom so large. We don't wear poppies in November. November 11th for us is Veterans Day, a day to remember all who served, rather than anything specifically to do with World War I. It was only a war we joined briefly at the very end, but it is important to know about because of the consequences that it would bring for us and the whole world. I'm Anne Grace Evans, and this is a practical guide to American history. August 1914 was an uneasy time. Things were more or less peaceful in Europe, and that always made everyone uneasy, because that wasn't typically the norm. Great Britain and Germany had been eyeing each other warily for a while, quietly building up their respective militaries in anticipation of their expected showdown. So Europe was a tinderbox. All it needed was the match. It came in the form of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Now, it might seem a bit random that the murder of this guy, even if he was heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, should engulf basically the entire world in war. But do you remember that large congress they had in Vienna about 100 years earlier? The one with the fancy ball where they celebrated defeating Napoleon? It kind of all started there. At the Congress of Vienna, the participants ended up setting some precedents. First, they started Frankensteining together some new kingdoms. With the stroke of a pen, distinct nations, with their own separate traditions and cultures and languages, were suddenly under the umbrella of a new king or emperor, without much say in the matter. It turns out that the revolutionary spirit had not gone out of the people, despite what the politicians at this Congress had hoped. A very strong wave of nationalism, and the spirit of what it meant to have a certain identity, had come to dominate the 19th century. This is the conflict where all that fervor boiled over. The other precedent that the Congress of Vienna set was the commitment to back each other up for the sake of the principle of empire. The European powers were so committed to the idea of keeping any seeds of rebellion from growing, or any would-be conquerors from trying to consolidate power on the continent, that they were prepared to join forces and come to each other's aid no matter what. In the lead-up to World War I, Germany was allied with Austria-Hungary and Italy, and Great Britain was allied with France and Russia. Because it was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne who was murdered in Serbia, the Austro-Hungarians declared war on the Serbs. Russia had ties with Serbia and felt duty-bound to protect it from invasion, so they declared war as well. Germany declared war on Russia as Austria-Hungary's ally, and then on France as Russia's ally. Germany's invasion of neutral Belgium in order to get to France caused Great Britain to enter the war, and in the span of a month, what might have stayed a local conflict became a world war. The war started out normal enough. Armies on horseback, armies on foot, going off to battle the same as they had done for thousands of years. Some soldiers were even on bicycles, so perhaps a touch of modernity. But very soon, these soldiers found out that this conflict was going to play out differently than they had imagined. Veterans of the American Civil War might have been able to warn them about what to expect, but the great old armies of Europe seemed to be somewhat oblivious to just how much the world had changed. Unfortunately, the spirit of invention which had characterized the turn of the century had also extended to the instruments of war, machine guns and more accurate artillery. So when the armies dug in with entrenched battle lines, they didn't realize at first that should they decide to come over the top, they were basically just going to get mowed down. Stalemate set in pretty quickly, as the armies of both sides realized they couldn't really advance without horrible loss of life. The stalemate itself also became pretty horrific. Parts of France and Belgium are forever topographically changed because of the entrenched front lines. Men lived, ate, and slept in the trenches, developing a condition called trench foot that occurred from living in cold, damp conditions. They were basically exposed to the elements, and the trenches didn't always keep them sheltered from incoming enemy fire. And it couldn't protect them from the poison gas. Poisonous gas was a mixture of chlorine, phosgene, and mustard gas, which caused choking, lung damage, blistering, and sometimes blindness. Eventually gas masks were implemented in the trenches, but poison gas still caused about 1 million casualties. From afar, this all seems terrible, and Americans were more than happy to stay out of it. It really had nothing to do with them, and the memories of the Civil War still existed for many people. America had other things to deal with, like women's suffrage for one. The issue of votes for women was becoming a more pertinent one, and politicians hoped to court women voters in anticipation. As a general rule, women were not in favor of the country going to war. When Woodrow Wilson was elected president in 1912, early on he showed a preference for the war, though he knew it would be unpopular. He viewed it as a fight for democracy and for the principle of popular sovereignty for different ethnic groups, like the Serbs, swallowed into large empires. But he knew he'd need to get the women on board if he wanted to achieve his aims. His transition from an opponent of women's suffrage to a vocal supporter very closely accompanied his European aims. Fortunately for him, events conspired to drag America into the conflict. The first was the sinking of the Lusitania. The Lusitania was a luxury ocean liner, torpedoed by German U-boats off the coast of Ireland. The attack killed 1,197 civilians, including 128 Americans. There was a bit of a gray area. The Lusitania was carrying munitions for the war, and Germany had warned Americans that they viewed it as a legitimate target of war before the ship embarked. But that didn't seem to matter. Americans viewed Germany's actions as barbaric, and public opinion began to shift towards sympathy and support for the British, French, and Russian allies. But it probably wouldn't have been enough to tip the United States into war without the Zimmermann telegram. This was an unusual diplomatic communication that just so happened to fall into American hands. The German ambassador to Mexico telegrammed the Mexican government that, should America enter the war, then Germany would aid Mexico in invading and annexing Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. When this information was made public, Americans were outraged. Wilson asked for, and got, a declaration of war from Congress in April 1917. At the time, the United States only had a small standing army. A draft was instituted right away, and National Guard units were called up. Meanwhile, the nature of war was being forever changed on the battlefields of Europe, and from what many Americans would think was an unlikely source. The Canadian Expeditionary Force had deployed with the rest of the dominions of the British Empire, like Australia and New Zealand. But the Germans soon found that the Canadians were an especially formidable foe because of how innovative they were. Generals would have to disguise Canadian troop movements because the Germans had identified the Canadians as the Allies' shock troops and knew that if they were moving, an attack was imminent. They demonstrated their ability to work together and execute at the Battle of Vimy Ridge. The French had been trying to capture the ridge, but they were taking on too many casualties without any lasting success. The Canadians did it in a day. All 4 Canadian divisions fought together, synchronizing the timing of their artillery bombardment to come just before their infantry assault. This wasn't a loosely organized, fly-by-the-seat-of-your-pants operation. They had prepared carefully, each man carrying a map so that he would know where he was meant to be and what he was meant to be doing, just as they had practiced. They communicated effectively and used the reconnaissance from aircraft to target gun emplacements with artillery. They suffered minimal casualties. Their tactics were revolutionary, and other Allied armies quickly came to adopt this theory of coordination. Certainly the reconnaissance that airplanes could offer changed the game. But the introduction of the Air Force also meant that the men in the trenches had to be on guard from attacks from above. Strafing airplanes could cause serious damage, which is how the air became its own battleground. Enemy planes would engage each other in a new type of warfare, dogfighting, to try to knock out as much of the other side's air power as possible. The most formidable and respected dogfighter of them all was Manfred von Richthofen, commonly known as the Red Baron, because he had his plane painted red to be recognizable. In his dogfighting career, the Red Baron had 80 confirmed kills, before being shot down himself in 1918. His plane crashed behind British lines, and on discovering his body, the Royal Air Force organized a full military funeral for him, out of respect. Coming into a conflict that had already been blaring for a while, America had immense pressure on it to turn the tide of the stalemate. One of the most significant engagements involving American soldiers was at the Meuse-Argonne. It's not an offensive that we talk all that much about compared to Gettysburg or D-Day, but it was the deadliest campaign in the history of the United States Army. It lasted a little over 2 weeks, right up to the Armistice. It was the inexperienced Americans' primary taste for the slow and grinding pace of modern warfare. It did produce one story that became legend, as well as propaganda. Corporal Alvin York was to take part with his unit in a raid that would attempt to go after the German machine gun nests. His unit was pinned down, so he decided to go ahead and take an entire machine gun nest by himself. He was a farmer from Tennessee, and he said that he approached the German entrenchments the way he would if he were hunting turkeys, picking them off one by one from behind. He ended up killing 25 soldiers and taking 132 as prisoners, by himself. His actions made him famous. He was honored with the ticker tape parade in New York City, and was presented with the U.S. Medal of Honor. World-famous Hollywood actor Gary Cooper would play him in the movie version. Also at the Meuse-Argonne offensive, another future Medal of Honor winner distinguished himself. Henry Johnson of the Harlem Hellfighters single-handedly saved his fellow soldiers from a German raiding party, earning the nickname the Black Death. Johnson wouldn't have a movie made about his exploits, and he was only awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously in 2015. But his actions during the war did earn him a degree of fame in his lifetime. He gave a series of lecture tours throughout the United States, but audiences weren't interested in hearing about the discrimination that Black veterans faced on returning home. The other major American offensive of the war was the Battle of Belleau Wood. To this day, the United States Marine Corps remembers the battle as central to its development as an expeditionary force. The valor that Americans displayed there impressed the French enough to grant the 5th and 6th Marine Regiments the Fourragère on their left shoulder, a sign of distinguished service. Americans had proved themselves on a global stage and shown that they could have a central importance in geopolitics. In total, there were approximately 320,000 American casualties. On the home front, the war was far away, but it still left its mark on culture. All forms of media, including moving pictures, were used to create pro-war propaganda. A popular comedy in 1918 was the film Shoulder Arms, a slapstick version of life in the trenches, featuring a young comic actor named Charlie Chaplin. Chaplin had been a vaudeville performer in England before coming to America to pursue a career in the movies. His creation, the Tramp, a silly character who causes confusion and chaos, made him wealthy and famous, a kind of fame that had previously only been reserved for heads of state and titans of business. His comfortable life in sunny California made him somewhat of a controversial figure in his home country, where other able-bodied men were being sent to the front in France, but American audiences loved him. American soldiers were dying as well, but in an ocean away. It could be more easily removed from one's day-to-day life. The American home was starting to look a lot more like the one we're used to today. Materials like Pyrex and stainless steel were invented to improve the comfort and convenience of the housewife, and electricity was starting to play a bigger role. Catalogs from the time advertised vacuum cleaners, electric irons, electric fans, radiators, electric flashlights, and an early version of the washing machine. A world away, in more ways than one. Soldiers were tired of war, and the Spanish flu had begun to creep into the trenches, adding yet another way for young men to meet their deaths on the battlefield. Though both sides' aims hadn't really been achieved, they were more eager to have the conflict over than completely settled. At 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918, an armistice, an agreement to cease hostilities, went into effect. The following summer, a treaty was signed formally, ending the hostilities in the town of Versailles, France. It was definitely heavily weighted in favor of the Allies Great Britain, the United States, and France. Germany agreed to take full responsibility for the war and to pay billions in reparations. It also had to give up a large chunk of its European territory, including the highly prized and endlessly disputed Alsace-Lorraine, and all of its overseas colonies. The German army was restricted to 100,000, and they were forbidden to have warplanes, submarines, or major weapons of any kind. The loss of so much territory led to the eventual collapse of the Austro-Hungarian and German empires. The Treaty of Versailles also established the League of Nations, a precursor to the United Nations, meant to encourage countries to get together to arbitrate through diplomacy, rather than resorting to the kind of disastrous war that would result if these modernized countries ever clashed again. But the losses from the war, especially in Europe, were incalculable. Not just the sheer number of dead, wounded, missing, and scarred for life, but the psychic after effects on everyone. 6% of British men were killed. This immense loss altered the shape of society, upending class structures and hollowing out entire villages. The burning blasts of war have shriveled, blackened, and destroyed the world we once knew. Old landmarks have disappeared, remarked one British observer. In the former German and Austro-Hungarian empires, people experienced more than just a change of political leadership. Millions of people woke up to find that they no longer lived in the country that they had yesterday. Understandably for many people, this caused an identity crisis, and for the more radical among them, it led to feelings of anger and nationalistic pride, the same kind that had led to the assassination of the Archduke and the beginning of the war in the first place. But for most people, it was simply the demoralizing realization that really nothing in their lives could be counted on. There was one phenomenon that was especially noticeable in the wake of the war. Veterans returning home changed, subject to nightmares and other nervous symptoms. People at the time called it shell shock. We know it today as post-traumatic stress disorder. Men returning from battle had always experienced psychological disturbance, but the intensity of the trenches took a major toll on a generation of young men. The other reason that the condition of shell shock was more observable after the First World War is that thanks to new ways of thinking, people knew to look for it. A new field of study, psychoanalysis, was gaining traction. In particular, a psychologist named Sigmund Freud had hypothesized that the key to hysteria and other conditions of the mind lay not in physical cures, but in working out the internal logic that was contributing to the patient's mental anguish. That meant talking it out, getting to the root of the trauma, rather than earlier solutions like electroshock therapy. Talk therapy seems normal enough to us now, but when Freud was first posing his ideas, they seemed insane. Thoughts and feelings aren't things you can see. Before the early 19th century, people wouldn't even have given much thought to their internal lives, the emotions that made them tick. So the idea that you could heal mental illness through treating thoughts and feelings was revolutionary. Which brings us to another massive change that World War I brought about, the Russian Revolution. I won't get too deep in the weeds on Russian history, but the end of Tsarist Russia and the beginnings of the Soviet Union are important events to know. Russia's losses in the war, like other nations, were great, but this was coming on top of the general mismanagement of Russia by Tsar Nicholas II. The Tsar was compelled to abdicate, and reformers went about trying to set up a new liberal democracy. But that wasn't nearly enough for some people. The Bolshevik Party, led by Vladimir Lenin, wanted far more radical changes to society benefiting peasants and workers. This led to civil war between White Russians, proponents of the democratic government, and Red Russians, supporters of Lenin's socialist movement. The Bolsheviks would emerge victorious and establish the Soviet Union, a country based on the principles of Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto. The impact of this on world history would be immense. Epilogue. French President Emmanuel Macron gave a great speech about nationalism in Paris on the 100th anniversary of the Armistice that ended World War I. In it, he said, "Patriotism is the exact opposite of nationalism. Nationalism is a betrayal of patriotism." For people potentially confused about the difference between the two, patriotism is loving and having pride in your country, warts and all, and nationalism is demanding that your country be a certain way and display certain characteristics. So yes, the two are in conflict with one another. Nationalism has a blasé attitude toward violence. Sometimes you've got to bust some skulls for your worldview. A concept that will more fully develop in the next chapter. The truth is that nationalism and democracy don't go well together because there is no room for multiculturalism or difference of opinion. Let's take it back to the Bill of Rights. Remember what the very first thing in it is? Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The idea that for one person to be free, everyone needs to be able to enjoy the same degree of freedom. And if someone doesn't like somebody else's choices, tough. That's what liberty looks like. Granted, we've never been perfect at practicing this. But in Europe in the early 20th century, it wasn't that diversity wasn't celebrated. It's that in lots of places, it simply didn't exist. An understanding of what the nation wasn't common values and ideas. It was shared culture and heritage. Or rather, it was one dominant culture or heritage dictating while others were ignored. Hence nationalist movements like the one that killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand. I think we can all support that kind of nationalistic impulse. If you are living in a country where you are treated like an other or a second-class citizen, It's the natural thing to want to break away, to be liberated. We've always been different in that respect. We're made up of a mishmash of people who at some point in time came from elsewhere. So the Bill of Rights isn't simply an idealistic statement, it's a practical one. We have never formed a coherent whole. Yet we need to find a way to coexist here all the same. The main way that nationalism seems to take hold in this country is rewriting the narrative of who we are, obscuring the central thesis of coexistence, that other people might live differently, and you may hate the choices that they make, but they have every bit as much of a right to make them as you do. That's why there is such a concerted effort to rewrite history. If you haven't gleaned this by now, let me say it once again. History is the origin story by which we lead our lives. It gives us our reason. Whoever controls the past controls the future. And if you deem the past to be without flaws and impervious to criticism, that's the example you're trying to set for the future, to make criticism unpatriotic. But to say, my country is perfect and I will never believe otherwise, no matter what happens, that's not love. That's Stockholm Syndrome. I think another lesson to take away from the First World War is that hubris, something that is integral to nationalism, will always lead to ruin. Humility and an ability to admit mistakes and change course are the marks of good leadership, not unfettered confidence. It is a failure to recognize this, which will haunt people in the decades going forward, just as it continues to haunt us to this day.